Before we get started, I wanted to let everybody know that I have a new book that is available on Kindle, and it is called Recommended Reading for the True Conservative. 50 pages long, and if you have Kindle Unlimited, you can read it for free. Other than that, it's $3.99. So again, that is Recommended Reading for the True Conservative. And now, on with the podcast.
You know what I mean? And over there, they got double-decker buses. Those suckers are heavy. You get hit by one of those at 30 miles an hour. At least if you get hit by a bus here on the island, you have so much of a chance. First of all, nobody's in a hurry. You get hit by a bus here. Hey, bro. Walk it off. You okay? Shoots. All right. I've been to the news station here. I've been on the news many times, and they're always, people always step off the curb. They're not paying attention. They're looking at the buildings, or they're taking pictures, and, and they report them. A man was struck by a bus here today. His leg was broken. Doctors say he will be okay. London, England, getting hit by a double-decker bus going 30. A man exploded today when he was...
Good morning. It's Friday, Fight Song Friday, May the 1st, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have Varney and Company, motivation, meditation, and the Cold War. All that and more when I get back. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. Now, Varney and Company.
Thanks so much for being with us. Varney and Company picks it up right now. Stu, take it away.
Good morning, Maria. Good morning, everyone. It is May the 1st. That would be May Day, a day when the socialists take to the streets to push their version of a workers' paradise. Now, we're going the other way. We're celebrating capitalism. It's the best wealth creation machine around. 11 record highs for the S&P this year, 7 for the tech-heavy NASDAQ. And it's still going strong. Look at this. Pre-market action today. The Dow up maybe 130-odd points. S&P is up a fraction, or 15 points, 2%. The NASDAQ, a tiny downside move, 0.05 to the downside. That's it. Now, turn to oil, which has come down to $103 a barrel this morning. The Iranians have reportedly made a new proposal to Pakistani negotiators. Oil is not a negative for stocks right now. With gas, well, it's a political problem for the president, but investors are looking to the day when the strait is open and the price comes down. Today, regular is actually up another 9 cents a gallon to $4.39. That's the average. In California, it's up another 5 cents. $6.06 is your price out there. Diesel up 8 cents to $5.57. Yet stocks hit records. Go figure. Bitcoin holding around it's moved up to $78,000 a coin. The 10-year Treasury still yields around 440, 439 to be precise. The 2-year coming in around 390. It's at 389. All right, on the show today, a standout stock, Apple. iPhone sales surging. It brought in $111 billion in revenue in just 13 weeks. It's at 280, up 0.75%. The president heads to friendly territory today. He's going to the Villages, one of, if not the largest master-planned age-restricted communities in Florida. He'll get a good reception. He's going to talk about tax breaks on Social Security. War news. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth says the ceasefire with Iran extends the 60 days the U.S. has before the war powers discussion in Congress. The Iranians want to see Congress step in. They are planning for time. Climate economics is collapsing. Studies that were used to support all manner of environmental policies have been debunked and withdrawn. It's the Trump team that's got to clean up the mess. You think the science is in. It's not. The science is out. And the Artemis II astronauts, they're here in New York City, and they'll be on the set with us in our next hour. Yeah, Friday, May 1st, 2026.
And that was Stuart. Nonprofit news now. Back in a minute. Thank you. A liberal will try to manipulate or control you, but when you have a solid sense of self-worth, you will recognize that you don't need to put up with their games. You'll be able to stand up for yourself even when the liberal tries to guilt or shame you into compliance. One of the most empowering aspects of self-worth is the ability to walk away from toxic relationships. Liberals rely on your fear of being alone, your lack of self-esteem, and your need for validation. They use these fears to keep you tethered to them even when they're treating you poorly. But when you have a healthy sense of self-worth, you realize that you're not bound to them. You don't need their validation, and you don't need their approval. You're whole and complete on your own. When you internalize this truth, walking away from a liberal becomes not only possible, but an act of reclaiming your power and self-respect. At the heart of it all, self-worth is the antidote to liberal manipulation. A liberal can control you if you let them make you feel small, insignificant, or unworthy. When you recognize your own worth, you break free from their grasp. You become someone who can stand tall in the face of their manipulation, someone who is not easily swayed by their tactics. By cultivating self-worth, you create an emotional shield that protects you from their attacks, allowing you to maintain your dignity and power no matter what they throw your way. A statement that commands respect is a powerful tool when dealing with a liberal. Liberals rely on manipulation, charm, and intimidation to control those around them. They thrive on a sense of superiority, often seeing themselves as above others. They expect to be treated as such. For this reason, they're quick to dismiss anyone they view as weak. They're vulnerable. When you utter the right words, one sentence in particular, you can disrupt their sense of power. They're making them reconsider their approach. It is the type of statement that forces a liberal to pause and reassess the dynamics of the relationship because it signals that you're no longer a target to be controlled. The beauty of this statement is its simplicity. Liberals are often thrown off by individuals who do not play into their manipulative games. When you speak with clarity, confidence, and authority, you immediately set yourself apart from others who may be more willing to tolerate their toxic behavior. This one statement acts as a declaration of firm assertion of your boundaries and your self-worth. It is not an invitation for negotiation or debate, but rather an ultimatum that makes it clear you will no longer tolerate being treated poorly. The key to this statement lies in its ability to cut through the liberals' defenses. Liberals are excellent at using flattery, charm, and subtle psychological tactics to control the people around them. They often play on their emotions, using guilt, shame, and fear to maintain their power. They may make you feel uncomfortable for their happiness or responsible for their happiness, or manipulate you into believing that their needs are more important than yours. By delivering a statement that exudes authority and self-assurance, you immediately deflate their sense of control. Stop being someone they can manipulate, and instead, you become someone who commands respect. What makes this statement so effective is its power to neutralize the liberal tactics. Liberals often expect others to tolerate their behavior because they're used to being admired or feared. They have cultivated a persona of dominance and self-importance that has allowed them to avoid consequences for their actions. When you speak in a way that challenges this dynamic, you send a message that you will not tolerate their attempts to diminish or exploit you. This is especially true when you say it with calmness and confidence. Liberals are not used to being confronted in this way, and they often struggle to respond when they can no longer manipulate the situation. It's also important that the statement be clear and unequivocal. The liberal is often a master of twisting words, manipulating intentions, and avoiding responsibility. They may try to downplay or ignore your feelings, convincing you that you are overreacting or being unreasonable. The more ambiguous your statement, the easier it will be for them to dismiss it or twist it into something that benefits them. The power of this statement lies in its directness. You need to be crystal clear about what you are saying so there's no room for misinterpretation. You're not asking for respect, you're demanding it. The psychological impact on the liberal is significant. Liberals operate in a world where they are the center of attention and everyone else is secondary. When they encounter someone who refuses to be intimidated or controlled, it shakes their sense of superiority. For the first time, they may be confronted with the reality that they do not have the power they once believed they had over you. The liberal thrives on dominance, but when they meet somebody who stands their ground without hesitation, it creates an internal conflict. They must decide whether to adjust their behavior or face the consequences of their actions. This statement can be a game changer because it not only protects you from further manipulation, but also sends a message to others who may be observing the interaction. Liberals often operate in environments where their behavior is unchecked and they are used to manipulating situations to their advantage. But when someone stands up to them, it forces others to recognize the liberal's true nature. It sets a precedent that such behavior will not be tolerated and signals to those around you that you are not someone to be trifled with. This has the potential to change the dynamics of the relationship, creating a more balanced and healthier environment. The effectiveness of this statement lies not only in what you say, but also in how you say it. The delivery matters. You must speak with conviction, without hesitation or apology. Liberals are highly attuned to weakness and uncertainty, so if your words are laced with doubt, they will exploit it. Confidence in your delivery is crucial because it reinforces the seriousness of your intent. This statement is not just a response to their behavior, it's a declaration of your self-respect, an affirmation of your worth, and a line in the sand that says, I will not tolerate disrespect. By using this statement, you create a clear boundary that is not negotiable. Liberals thrive on ambiguity because it gives them room to manipulate. But when you speak directly with unwavering confidence, it forces them to recognize that their unusual tactics will not work on you. This single statement shifts the power dynamic, forcing the narcissist to either adjust their behavior or face the consequences. It's a moment of clarity, a turning point where you reclaim your power and take control of the relationship. Consistency is key when dealing with a liberal. liberals are adept at testing the waters, pushing boundaries, and looking for any sign of weakness or inconsistency in the way you enforce your limits. They thrive on unpredictability because it gives them the space to manipulate and control others. Inconsistent behavior on your part, whether in your responses or in how you enforce boundaries, only feeds into their desire to destabilize and dominate the relationship. The more consistent you are in your actions and responses, the more difficult it becomes for the liberal to continue their manipulative tactics. When it comes to dealing with liberals, they're constantly looking for opportunities to exploit any gaps in your defenses. If you allow one small instance of their behavior to slide, they will interpret that as a weakness. They may test you again and again, each time pushing further, to see just how much they can get away with. Liberals rely on the inconsistency of others to maintain control. Back in a minute. Thank you. There's a headline, so to speak, in Real Clear Politics, and it reads, "The left's disturbing reaction to would-be assassin." I was thinking about this yesterday when I was listening to this lady that I put on my podcast talking about psychopathy and more specifically gaslighting. And she described some various obvious gaslights. You're crazy. You don't know what you're talking about. That didn't happen. But the left today is more insidious. They have gotten more sophisticated about the way they perpetrate. So what they do now is they perpetrate with attitude rather than with words. So what you'll see on The View, what you'll see on CNN and other places, other left-wing places, when it comes to the attempted assassination of President Trump, is attitude. And their attitude suggests sort of a befuddlement, like they don't understand what the fuss is all about. What are you talking about? What assassin? What? Or they're very nonchalant about the whole thing. What? Big deal. Who cares? So what? And the whole point of this attitude that is to convince you that if you think this is a big deal, if you think this is a problem, you're insane. It's to get you to question your sanity, to sit there and say, am I crazy? Or did somebody actually try to assassinate the President of the United States and members of his cabinet? Don't get sucked into that. You may have perpetrators in your life that may come to you and maybe even flat out ask you, so what's the big deal? So what's the big deal about this guy from Torrance? What's the big deal? They want you to explain because then that gives them a sense of power. And don't do it. Don't take the bait. What you simply do is you say, you mean you don't know? When are you going to figure it out? And then walk away. That's the best way to handle the perpetrators. Back in a minute. Thank you. About Mom Donnie, or Damn Mommy, or whatever you want to call him, Comrade Zohran. Let's do it that way. And you notice he's floundering, and he's floundering deliberately because Karl Marx never envisioned what it is that people should do once they've gained power, once Marxists should do once they've gained power. Marxism is always about the struggle to gain power, not about actually achieving it. He says that at the end of time, after capitalism has expanded all over the globe and there's nowhere left to expand, that's the time in which Marxist labor will rise up and throw off their capitalist masters and usher in socialist paradise. Along the way to socialist paradise will be a world government of some sort. But he doesn't say what it is that they're supposed to do. So whenever a socialist gets into power, they flounder because there's no guidelines from Marx or anyone else for that matter. Alinsky is the same way. He's very good at agitating for change, but once that change occurs, what is the activist supposed to do? No answer. And so that's why you see Venezuela goes down the toilet, Cuba goes down the toilet, North Korea is down the toilet. These Marxists have gained power, but they don't know what to do with it. And the same thing happens with Mamdani or Comrade Zohran. He is now in power, and we watch him flounder, trying to figure out, what am I supposed to do now? And so it makes me wonder, maybe the best thing that we can do is give socialists all the power they want, and then they become targets, political targets. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Cold War.
There is a line in the ocean that exists nowhere physically but matters enormously politically. The 12 nautical mile boundary that defines territorial waters is invisible to any instrument that measures the sea itself. It has no color, no depth, no acoustic signature. A submarine crossing it experiences nothing that a submarine crossing open ocean does not also experience. The water pressure at depth is the same on both sides. The temperature gradients are the same. The darkness is the same. What changes when a submarine crosses into another nation's territorial waters is entirely a matter of law and of what that law permits the state whose waters are being entered to do in response. Under the legal framework that both the United States and the Soviet Union publicly endorsed throughout the Cold War, entering another nation's territorial waters in a warship without permission was a violation of sovereignty. The state whose waters were entered had the right, under international law, to take action. What that action could include, and what the limits on it were, depended on the specific circumstances and the willingness of the parties to press the situation to its legal conclusion. For more than 30 years, the United States Navy sent submarines across that line into Soviet territorial waters on a systematic, deliberate, and classified basis. The program was not an improvised response to a particular crisis or a one-time decision made in specific circumstances. It was an institutional program with a code name, a budget, a doctrine, and a steady rotation of vessels and crews. The code name was Holystone, later changed to Pinnacle, and then to Bollard as classification practices evolved. But the program itself continued, regardless of what it was called, from the early 1950s until it was significantly curtailed in the 1970s and continued in modified form beyond that. The program collected intelligence that could only be collected from inside Soviet territorial waters. It listened to communications from Soviet naval bases that could not be received from the outside. It photographed Soviet coastal installations through periscopes at ranges impossible to achieve from international waters. It tested Soviet detection capabilities by approaching naval facilities and measuring what response, if any, those facilities generated. It provided early warning data on Soviet submarine movements that informed American strategic planning at the highest levels. And it gathered acoustic data on Soviet submarines, leaving and entering their bases data on the specific acoustic signatures of specific vessels that would later allow American forces to identify those vessels at long range, open ocean information of a kind and quality that no other platform and no other method could have provided in those years. To understand why this program existed and why it was considered worth the risks it carried, it is necessary to understand the specific intelligence problem that the United States faced in the early Cold War and the particular character of Soviet geography. The Soviet Union's principal naval bases for its northern fleet were concentrated on the Kola Peninsula, a piece of Arctic territory flanked by the Barents Sea to the north and the White Sea to the east. The bases at Murmansk, Severomorsk, and the surrounding complex of facilities were the home port for the submarines that carried Soviet ballistic missiles and the surface vessels and aircraft that supported them. The approaches to these bases, the channels and fjords through which submarines departed on patrol and returned, were inside Soviet territorial waters for significant portions of their length. Any observation of these approaches from the outside required accepting ranges and angles that degraded the quality of what could be observed to the point of operational irrelevance. The Pacific Fleet bases at Vladivostok and Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky presented similar geometry, with the additional complication that the Sea of Japan and the Sea of Okhotsk and the bodies of water through which Pacific Fleet submarines had to transit to reach open ocean were partially enclosed by Soviet and Japanese territory in ways that created constrained choke points. Monitoring Soviet submarine activity in these areas from international waters was possible in a limited sense and impossible in the comprehensive sense that American strategic planners required. The signals from Soviet naval installations, once they passed beyond the 12-mile line into international waters, had attenuated to the point where much of the useful information in them had been lost. The acoustic recordings of Soviet submarines operating in the shallow near-coastal waters, where their signatures were clearest, required proximity that international waters did not provide. American strategic planning in the Cold War depended critically on knowing what the Soviet Navy was doing, how many submarines were at sea at any given time, what were their patrol areas, what were their acoustic signatures, and how had those signatures changed as new propulsion systems and hull designs were introduced? How quickly could they be deployed in a crisis? What did their departure and return patterns reveal about Soviet military readiness and the state of their operational tempo? These questions could not be answered from international waters with anything close to the precision that American planners needed. And the answers to these questions were not merely of academic, strategic interest. They informed the targeting of American nuclear weapons, the deployment of American anti-submarine forces, and the assessment of Soviet first strike capability that underpinned the entire American nuclear deterrent posture. Getting them wrong could have consequences of a different order from ordinary intelligence failure. The decision to conduct systematic covert operations inside Soviet territorial waters was therefore a decision made by people who had assessed the intelligence requirements against the available collection methods and concluded that the requirements could not be met without accepting the risks that territorial water operations entailed. It was not made lightly, and it was not made at a low level. The program required authorization from the highest levels of the American government and maintained that authorization through multiple administrations, both Republican and Democratic. Across the full span of the Cold War's most dangerous decades, presidents who were briefed on the program's existence chose not to terminate it. The intelligence it produced was considered sufficiently valuable to justify the continuation of the risk. The submarines assigned to Holystone operations were not specialized vessels in the way that later intelligence collection ships were purpose-built for their missions. They were standard American attack submarines, progressively updated through the successive classes of the Cold War period, from the diesel-electric boats of the early 1950s to the nuclear-powered vessels that made longer, deeper operations possible as the decade ended and the next began. The first Holystone operations were conducted by diesel-electric submarines of the Palau and Tench classes, veterans of the Pacific War, adapted to the very different demands of covert intelligence collection in confined Arctic waters. These boats had real limitations for the mission. Their battery endurance constrained the time they could spend submerged inside Soviet territorial waters. Their noise signatures were greater than what the nuclear boats that followed them would produce. Their diving depth was more limited, reducing the options available when Soviet anti-submarine forces were in the area. The nuclear submarines changed the equation significantly. When the Nautilus and its successors began entering service in the late 1950s, the United States suddenly had submarines that could operate submerged indefinitely, that could dive to depths beyond the reach of Soviet depth charges of the period, and that were substantially quieter than their diesel predecessors at the speeds used for this kind of covert approach. The Skate class, the Skipjack class, and subsequently the Permit and Sturgeon classes that defined the American attack submarine force through the 1960s and 1970s gave Holystone operations a platform capability that extended both the scope of what could be collected and the depth of Soviet waters into which the program could operate. Nuclear submarines could approach Soviet bases, spend extended periods on station, gathering intelligence, and depart with a sustained stealth that diesel boats could not match. The crews who conducted these patrols occupied a specific position in the taxonomy of Cold War risk. They were not volunteers for a suicide mission, and the program's designers had not intended them to be. The expectation was that a well-handled submarine, operating with appropriate caution, could enter Soviet territorial waters, conduct its collection activities, and depart without detection. The Soviet Navy's anti-submarine warfare capabilities in the early years of the program were limited enough that this assessment had a reasonable basis. American submarines were quieter than Soviet detection systems could reliably locate in those years, and the techniques developed for approaching Soviet naval facilities coming in at depth, using the acoustic masking provided by ambient sea noise, timing approaches to coincide with periods of Soviet naval activity that would mask the submarine's presence in the acoustic environment, gave the crews meaningful tools for managing the risk. The personal experience of a crew member on a Holy Stone patrol is something that only a small number of people have directly described, and most of those descriptions have come in partial and carefully hedged form in the years since the Cold War's end. What emerges from those accounts is a picture of a specific kind of professional tension, not the acute fear of direct combat, but the sustained watchfulness of operating in a place where discovery would produce consequences that no established protocol could fully resolve. Crew members have described the particular character of the silence that prevailed inside a submarine approaching a Soviet base, the deliberate reduction of noise from every system that could be quieted, the crew moving carefully to avoid sounds that might propagate through the hull, the sonar operators listening with the intense concentration that comes from understanding that what they hear is the only information available about whether the submarine has been detected. The officers who commanded these operations have described the calculation that accompanied every decision inside Soviet waters, the constant assessment of whether the intelligence being collected justified the continued time on station, whether a particular noise or contact warranted immediate departure, whether the situation was still within the parameters that authorized the operation. The techniques were effective, much of the time. The program generated a substantial and continuous flow of intelligence over the years it operated. The acoustic signatures collected inside Soviet bases gave American analysts a catalog of Soviet submarine sounds that proved invaluable for long-range detection and classification work. The communications intelligence provided insights into Soviet naval operations and planning that could not have been obtained in any other way. The periscope photography documented changes in Soviet naval infrastructure, the construction of new facilities, the modification of existing ones, the introduction of new vessel types that informed American intelligence assessments throughout the period. The early warning data on Soviet submarine deployments gave American Strategic Command an understanding of Soviet naval readiness that directly affected American military planning at the most senior levels. By the measures that intelligence programs are typically assessed against, Holy Stone was producing results that justified its existence. It was also producing incidents. The specific incidents that occurred during Holy Stone operations over the decades of the program's operation represent one of the most consequential gaps in the public historical record of the Cold War. Many of them remain classified. Some have been partially described in memoirs by former submarine officers or in investigative journalism pieces that drew on anonymous sources. A few have been acknowledged by the American government in contexts where denial was no longer plausible. The picture that emerges from these partial accounts is of a program that, over 30 years, produced a significant number of close calls encounters with Soviet vessels, detection events that required rapid departure, moments where the outcome was uncertain enough that the crews involved would remember them for the rest of their lives. One category of incident involved physical collisions or near collisions between American submarines conducting Holy Stone operations and Soviet vessels. The confined waters near Soviet naval bases, the same waters that made them valuable collection environments, also made them dangerous operating spaces. Soviet submarines departing or returning from patrol, Soviet surface vessels conducting their own operations, and Soviet anti-submarine warfare assets patrolling the approaches to the bases all occupied the same constrained geography that American submarines were attempting to operate in covertly. The mathematical probability of contact increased with proximity and with time on station, and the Holy Stone program required both. Several collisions between American submarines and Soviet vessels are known to have occurred during Cold War operations, though the specific connection of any individual collision to Holy Stone is not always publicly established. The American Navy's practice of officially denying such incidents, attributing damage to operational casualties or equipment failures, reflected an institutional imperative to protect program's existence rather than a factual description of what had happened. Soviet vessels that returned to port with damage consistent with submarine collision were not in a position to prove American involvement in ways that would survive diplomatic challenge, particularly when the American government maintained categorical denials. The mutual interest of both sides in not escalating specific incidents into formal diplomatic crises created a practical system for managing the incidents when they occurred, a system that depended on both sides choosing not to press. The specific questions that would make denials untenable. Another category of incident involved detection events, in which Soviet anti-submarine forces identified or suspected the presence of an American submarine inside their territorial waters and attempted to localize and hold contact with. The American response doctrine for these situations specified that the submarine should make maximum use of its acoustic stealth to break contact and depart the area, a doctrine that was easier to specify than to execute in the confined waters near Soviet bases. Several such events, in the accounts of former crew members who have discussed them in the years since the Cold War ended, involved periods of sustained tension in which the outcome was not certain hours, during which the crew operated in the full knowledge that they were inside Soviet territorial waters, that Soviet forces were actively searching for them, and that the circumstances of discovery would be unlike anything that American submarine doctrine had fully prepared for. The evolution of Soviet anti-submarine warfare capabilities over the decades of the program's operation was a persistent challenge that required continuous adaptation on the American side. In the early 1950s, the Soviet Navy's ability to detect and classify submerged submarines was limited enough that the risk assessment underlying Holy Stone operations was credible. Soviet underwater detection technology, their sonar systems, and their anti-submarine aircraft and surface vessel capabilities were all substantially below the American standard of the period. The American submarines conducting Holy Stone operations in those early years were operating with a meaningful stealth advantage that made the assessment of manageable risk something more than optimism. By the mid-1960s, that advantage had narrowed. The Soviet Navy had invested heavily in anti-submarine warfare, following the experiences of the early Cold War, developing sonar systems, acoustic monitoring networks, and maritime patrol aircraft that made the operating environment inside Soviet territorial waters meaningfully more dangerous than it had been a decade earlier. By the early 1970s, the Soviet anti-submarine warfare capability had reached a level where the risk calculations of the early program years no longer applied in the same form. This was the operating context within which the program was producing the incidents that would eventually contribute to the political pressure for its curtailment. This evolution in Soviet capability did not cause the program to be terminated, but it did cause a continuous process of adaptation. The approaches used, the time spent on station, the depths at which American submarines operated, and the collection priorities that justified the risk being taken. The program in 1970 was not the same program that had operated in 1955, both because the platforms had changed and because the threat environment had changed. The intelligence requirements it served had also evolved, as American understanding of Soviet naval capabilities matured and as new questions replaced old ones at the top of the collection priority list. This is the nature of long-running intelligence programs. They are not static entities, but living systems that adapt to the changing intersection of requirement and risk. And the 30-year arc of Holy Stone embodies that adaptation across the full span of the Cold War's most dangerous period. The public exposure of the Holy Stone program came in January 1975, when journalist Seymour Hersh published a story in the New York Times based on sources within the American intelligence and military establishment. Hersh's reporting described the program in terms that were specific enough to make official denial implausible, naming the general nature of the operations, the approximate scope of the program, and several incidents that had occurred in the course of it. The story placed the Holy Stone program in the context of a broader pattern of American intelligence collection activities that Hersh and other journalists were covering in the period following Watergate and during the Church Committee's investigation of American intelligence agencies. The Ford administration's response to the Hersh story combined official silence with background statements that neither confirmed nor denied the program's existence, while indicating that the operations described served legitimate national security purposes. This was a calculated response designed to limit further disclosure without providing confirmation that would make the denial position untenable. It was also, by the standards of Cold War intelligence management, a relatively effective response. The story generated significant attention at the time of publication, but did not produce the kind of sustained political pressure that would have forced a comprehensive accounting of the program. The congressional response was more substantive, if ultimately limited in its public impact. The Church Committee, which was investigating American intelligence activities across a broad front in 1975 and 1976, received classified briefings on the Holy Stone program as part of its work. The committee's public report did not extensively describe the specifics of the program, reflecting the judgment that disclosing operational details would cause ongoing damage to national security. The classified annex to the committee's report, which presumably contained more specific information, remained classified. The net result was that the program received public acknowledgement in the broad sense it was now known to exist, while the specific details of its operations, its incidents, and its intelligence product remained protected. The Soviet response to the 1,975 revelations was notable for what it was not. There was no formal Soviet diplomatic protest of the kind that would have been expected if a nation had been publicly confirmed to have been operating covertly inside another nation's territorial waters for decades. The absence of a formal protest reflected the Soviet Union's own calculation of its interests. A formal protest would have required acknowledging that Soviet territorial waters had been penetrated repeatedly and over a long period without Soviet detection capabilities, identifying the operations in real time. It would have invited reciprocal attention to Soviet intelligence collection activities, which were extensive and included their own programs of operations in waters adjacent to American territory. And it would have required the Soviet government to explain to its own military and intelligence establishment why the violations it was formally protesting had not been detected and stopped. The practical result of these mutual calculations was that the 1,975 exposure of Holy Stone did not produce the diplomatic crisis that the program's original risk assessments had identified as the worst-case outcome of. Exposure. The superpowers had, by 1975, developed sufficient experience with the management of Cold War incidents to absorb even a significant public revelation about covert operations without allowing it to escalate beyond the diplomatic level. This capacity for managed exposure, the ability to publicly acknowledge something's existence while jointly agreeing not to fully address its implications, was itself a product of the Cold War's accumulated experience. With close calls and narrow escapes, the program's practical effect on American submarine operations in the period following the 1,975 exposure was significant. The political environment created by the revelations, combined with pressure from within the government for a more careful assessment of the risks the program was generating relative to the intelligence it was producing, led to a reduction in the frequency and depth of territorial water operations. The Carter administration, which came to office in January 1977, was more cautious about the legal and political dimensions of covert operations than its predecessors had been, and the climate within the intelligence community in the mid to late 1970s was one in which programs that could not survive public scrutiny were subject to heightened internal review. The specific form this reduction took, and the extent to which Holy Stone-style operations were curtailed versus modified rather than ended, are questions that the available public record does not definitively answer. Former naval officers who have discussed the period suggest that the program continued in some form, but with substantially increased caution and reduced frequency compared to its peak years. The Reagan administration's significant expansion of American naval capabilities and its more aggressive posture toward the Soviet Union in the early 1980s likely reversed some of the curtailment of the Carter years, though the specific operational record of that period remains largely classified. What is clear from the public record is that the American submarine force never fully abandoned the practice of operating in waters close to Soviet naval installations. The tactical value of the intelligence produced was too high, and the strategic requirements too pressing for a complete withdrawal from the operational zone that Holy Stone had defined. The question was always one of calibration: how close, how often, for how long, against what collection objectives, rather than whether to conduct these operations at all. The calibration shifted with the political and military environment, but the underlying practice persisted in some form throughout the Cold War and beyond. The broader significance of Operation Holystone in the history of the Cold War lies not primarily in the specific intelligence it collected, significant as that intelligence was, but in what the program reveals about how both superpowers actually conducted themselves in the decades when their public positions were defined by formal legal norms and that their covert operations were systematically violating. The United States was publicly committed to the freedom of international waters and the inviolability of national sovereignty. The Soviet Union made the same commitments in international forums. Both nations maintained the formal architecture of international law, while operating programs designed to extract maximum intelligence advantage from the other, using methods that the law they publicly endorsed would have defined as violations if they had been committed by anyone else. This gap between the stated principles and the operational practice is not unique to the Holystone program. It is characteristic of how both superpowers conducted the intelligence dimension of the Cold War across a range of activities: signals intelligence collection, covert operations, satellite reconnaissance before it was acknowledged. But the Holystone program makes the gap unusually visible because the specific activity involved is so unambiguous in legal terms. There is no doctrine of intelligence collection that provides legal cover for entering another nation's territorial waters in a warship without permission. The operations were illegal by any standard of international law that either side publicly endorsed. They were conducted because the intelligence requirement was considered to outweigh the legal constraints, and because the practical ability to enforce those constraints was limited enough that the risk of the violation being successfully prosecuted diplomatically was manageable. The men who conducted these operations were not, for the most part, aware of the full scope of what they were participating in. Individual submarine crew members knew they were on a sensitive mission in waters close to Soviet territory. Some knew more specifically that they were operating inside territorial waters. Few had the complete picture of a decades-long program that had been running since before many of them had joined the Navy. They did their jobs with the professional discipline that submarine service required, in conditions that were sometimes tense and occasionally genuinely dangerous, in service of intelligence requirements that they were trusted to execute without being fully briefed on the institutional architecture behind them. The captains who commanded these patrols carried more of the picture, though even they operated within a system of compartmented knowledge that limited what any individual knew about the full scope of the program. They were given specific operational parameters, routes, collection objectives, time on station requirements, detection thresholds at which departure was required, and they executed those parameters with the judgment and skill that submarine command required. Several of them, in memoirs or interviews conducted after the Cold War's end, have described the particular character of the tension that accompanied territorial water operations, a sustained professional alertness that differed qualitatively from the tension of other dangerous operations, because of the specific nature of what detection would have meant. It was not the acute fear of incoming ordnance, but the persistent awareness of occupying a legal and political position from which there was no exit that would leave all parties satisfied. The submarines that participated in Holystone operations over the decades of the program's existence are not specifically identified in any comprehensive public accounting. The program's compartmented structure means that the complete roster of vessels involved is not part of any declassified record. Some identifications have been made through the testimony of former crew members or through documents that have been partially declassified, but the complete picture remains outside the public domain. The vessels that conducted these operations are carrying their specific history in the form of classified operational records that may or may not be declassified in any foreseeable time frame. The men who served on those vessels know what they did. Most of them, by the terms of the oaths they took, have not described it in ways that the historical record can use. What the public record does establish is the scope and duration of a program that, for 3 decades, placed American submarines routinely inside Soviet territorial waters for intelligence collection purposes. That produced a continuous flow of strategic intelligence informing American military planning throughout the period. That was managed through a series of incidents and close calls whose full record remains classified. And that was eventually exposed, absorbed diplomatically without crisis, curtailed without being ended, and succeeded by programs that are themselves largely classified. It is a program that existed at the precise intersection of legal constraint and strategic necessity that the Cold War produced in multiple domains, where the rules that both sides publicly endorsed were systematically set aside in service of the imperatives that both sides privately pursued. And it is a program whose full history, the complete accounting of what was done and how often and what it cost and what it produced, remains one of the most significant classified gaps in the public record of the Cold War. The submarines went in, they collected what they came to collect, they came out most of the time. The line in the ocean that exists nowhere physically but matters enormously politically was crossed, and crossed again, and crossed again, for 30 years, by men whose names are not in any public record associated with this program, and whose specific contributions to American strategic intelligence during the Cold War will remain unacknowledged in any form that the historical record can.
And that was the Cold War. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that you're not neutral and that the government has no rights.